Growing up, it was just my mom and me. She had me young, at 20, and my biological dad was never in the picture. She told me once that they'd only been together for a few months when she got pregnant, and he didn't want kids. She gave him a choice, and he left without a backward glance. I think it was a pretty bitter split, because my mom chose not to ask for child support, and he never offered. So I never knew him, and honestly, he never really mattered to me. Thankfully, my grandparents were incredibly supportive and helped her through those early years. She was able to complete her education, get a job, and start building a life for us. Mom dated here and there while I was growing up. When I was around 8, she started seeing a guy named Tom. She had worked with him at some point, and they'd hit it off. Tom was decent. We got along okay, though we never really bonded deeply. Still, he didn't resent me or anything, and we just coexisted. They dated for 3 years before tying the knot, and for a while, it was nice having someone else around. 4 years into their marriage, my mom found out she was pregnant, and everyone was ecstatic. Even me. I didn't realize it then, but looking back, that was when things began to change. Once my mom had the twins, it was like a switch flipped. We started drifting apart, and it became obvious she was putting distance between us. I convinced myself it was just a phase, and that eventually things would go back to normal. I'd seen her struggle and make so many sacrifices for me, so I just couldn't believe she'd ever abandon me. I tried to be supportive and keep my distance to give her space, but nothing I did seemed to help. If anything, it seemed to annoy her even more. 6 months after my half-siblings were born, she and Tom sat me down for a serious talk. They told me that with 2 new babies in the house, they couldn't afford to keep me around anymore. I was only 16 then, technically still a minor, so they couldn't legally kick me out without consequences. Instead, they tried to nudge me out. They talked about how tight money was and how it was getting hard to support such a large household. It didn't make sense because they were both web developers and made enough to give us a good life up until then. It was obvious to me that they just didn't want me there anymore. I suggested finding a job to pitch in if money was such an issue, but my mom said that wasn't the point. She claimed they needed to save their resources for the kids who deserved it more. That was her exact phrasing. They deserved it more. And that was all I needed to hear. She didn't want me there anymore, so I left. They didn't give me any alternatives, didn't tell me where I could go or offer any support. They just wanted me gone. It wasn't a forced eviction, but they pushed me into a corner and I had nowhere else to go. So I went to my grandparents. They were horrified by what my mom had done. But they didn't want to cut her off entirely because they still wanted to be involved in my siblings' lives. They were getting older, so I couldn't rely on them for financial support. I found a part-time job while finishing high school and continued living with them. Occasionally, I'd see my mom and Tom when they visited my grandparents, but they barely acknowledged me. They seemed happy without me in their lives, and it hurt. My mom, especially, was like a different person, less irritable, more content. It was heartbreaking to realize she'd found peace in my absence. By the time college rolled around, I'd accepted that my mom wasn't going to help me. My grandparents were too old to handle a college move, so a few friends helped me settle into my dorm. I took out a student loan with one of my uncles co-signing since my mom and Tom refused. They told me they needed to save their resources for their kids' future. My uncle was a lifesaver, and I promised him I'd never default on the loan to avoid putting him at risk. I worked hard through college to cover my expenses and keep my debt low. After graduation, I kept working to become financially independent as quickly as possible. It was a struggle for the first couple of years with my entry-level salary, but I managed to pay my bills, reduce my debt, and even start saving a little for the future. It felt like I was finally building a life on my own terms, without anyone's help. My mom didn't come to my graduation, and I had no contact with her through those years. My grandparents supported me in spirit, though, and their pride meant everything. Eventually, I worked my way up at my company, and now, years later, I'm proud of what I've achieved. I'm 33, in a good position, and making a comfortable living. Ironically, that's around when my mom found out I was doing well. I never expected to see or hear from my mom again. After all, she made it clear she didn't want me in her life, and I'd come to terms with that a long time ago. So when I got a surprise visit from her and Tom out of the blue, I was more than a little taken aback. I didn't even know how they found my address since we hadn't been in contact in years. But there they were, standing on my doorstep, looking for all the world like they had something serious to discuss. For a brief moment I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd come to make things right. Maybe they were finally here to apologize, to admit they'd wronged me, and to try and make amends. I couldn't have been more wrong. After inviting them in, hoping for some kind of reconciliation, my mom and Tom wasted no time cutting to the chase. They started talking about how they'd heard from my uncle that I was doing well, and that I'd recently gotten a big promotion. My mom even threw in a line about how proud she was, though it sounded hollow. What really surprised me was how shocked they seemed that I hadn't told them anything about it. I mean, it wasn't like we'd stayed in touch or anything, so why would I share my life updates with them? But I kept my thoughts to myself and just let them talk. It didn't take long for them to shift the conversation from my success to their own troubles. They started going on about how they'd tried to start a business, but it had tanked, leaving them in a financial hole. Apparently, things had been hard for them these last few years, and now, with the twins getting close to college age, they were desperate to find a way to cover all the expenses. That's when they dropped the real reason for their visit. They wanted me to help pay for my siblings' college tuition. I could barely believe what I was hearing. They didn't come to apologize, congratulate me, or even to see how I was doing. They came because they needed money, and not just any money. They wanted me to fund college for 2 kids I barely knew. The audacity left me stunned for a moment, but then my anger took over. I told them flat out that I wasn't going to pay for my siblings' education. I reminded them that they'd been the ones to kick me out when I was a teenager, leaving me to fend for myself. I'd had to work through college and take on student loans because they wouldn't help me. And now, after all these years, they expected me to pay for the kids they prioritized over me? They didn't take my refusal well. My mom immediately started going on about how ungrateful I was, claiming I was disrespecting everything she'd done for me by not helping her out now. She tried to make it sound like I owed her something for raising me, saying she'd sacrificed so much for me when I was a kid. I almost laughed. She talked about those sacrifices like they were something extraordinary, but she was my mother. Raising me wasn't a favor, it was her responsibility. And as soon as she had other kids, she'd kicked me out and forgotten all about me. As if that wasn't enough, they both started trying to guilt trip me. Tom chimed in, saying that they had only been trying to give the twins the best life they could, and that I should have been mature enough to understand why they'd made the choices they did. They acted like it was my fault for being upset that they'd pushed me out of their lives. According to them, I should have just accepted it all and supported them. It was like they were twisting the narrative to make me seem like the bad guy for not sticking around to cheer them on after they kicked me out. By this point, I'd had enough. I told them that I wasn't about to pay for the education of 2 kids I barely knew, and that they had no right to ask anything of me after how they'd treated me. I pointed out that they'd made their priorities clear all those years ago, and that they couldn't just change the rules now because they were struggling. I reminded my mom that when I'd needed help, she'd turn me away, so now it was only fair that I do the same. That didn't go over well. My mom was livid, accusing me of being heartless and telling me that I'd forgotten everything she'd done for me. She even tried to bring up memories from when I was little, talking about how she'd struggled to raise me all on her own. But I wasn't a little kid anymore, and I wasn't about to fall for her emotional manipulation. I stayed firm and told them that they needed to leave. Things got ugly after that. They tried to tell me that I'd always been too involved in their lives, that I'd been annoying and overenthusiastic when they were trying to build their own family. Hearing that broke something in me. I'd only ever wanted to be part of their family, but they'd seen me as nothing more than an inconvenience. And now, after years of silence, they were here trying to make me feel guilty for moving on and building a life of my own. Eventually they left, but not before my mom threw out one last guilt trip, saying that I'd ruined any chance of a relationship with her by refusing to help. I just watched them go, wondering how it was possible for people to be so manipulative and self-centered. I'd wanted to believe, even after all these years, that maybe she'd change, but I realized that she was never going to be the mother I'd always hoped she could be. It was time to let go of that hope for good. After that visit, I felt a mix of relief and frustration. I had been so caught off guard by my mom and Tom showing up that it took a while for everything to sink in. The nerve they had to come to me for financial help after abandoning me was infuriating. I spent days replaying our conversation in my mind, analyzing every word and emotion. I realized I was finally free of the guilt that had hung over me for years. I didn't owe them anything. Not now, not ever. But the fallout didn't stop with their visit. My mom's attempts to guilt trip me escalated over the next few weeks. She started emailing me, reminding me of all the sacrifices she'd made when I was a child, as if those memories were supposed to elicit some kind of remorse or change of heart in me. The emails felt more like desperate pleas than heartfelt reflections, and I ignored most of them. After a while, I snapped and replied, telling her that her sacrifices didn't give her the right to demand anything from me, especially when she had pushed me out of her life. That only seemed to fuel her fire. She called me ungrateful, saying I was throwing away our relationship for the sake of money. I was baffled. I wasn't throwing away anything. She was the one who had made that choice years ago. I blocked her email, but it didn't stop her. She created new accounts, sending me the same tired messages, and I found myself more annoyed than ever. I finally decided to take a stand. I wouldn't let her manipulation pull me back into a relationship I'd fought so hard to move on from. Then one day, I got a call from my uncle. He was a little apprehensive, asking if I had spoken to my mom since their visit. I didn't hold back, telling him everything that had happened and how she was still trying to emotionally manipulate me. He sounded surprised and worried, and that made me feel a little guilty. He was genuinely trying to help me, and I appreciated his support back in college, but I was done with my mom's drama. He seemed to understand my frustration and promised to talk to her. "I just want to help, you know?" he said. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. I appreciated his intention, but I didn't want him to get caught in the crossfire of my mom's chaos. I just wanted to live my life without the weight of my past hanging over me. As the days went by, I focused on work and my personal life. I was making strides in my career, and my manager was impressed with my progress. I was starting to feel like I was truly establishing myself in the company. That felt good. I kept pushing forward, determined not to let my mom's drama drag me down. But then, one morning at work, I received a call from the receptionist that made my stomach drop. "Your mom is here," she said, her tone uneasy. My heart raced as she continued, "She's asking to see you." I didn't even know how she'd found my workplace, but my first thought was panic. I was afraid of what she might do or say. I wasn't ready to face her, not like this. I hadn't planned for a confrontation at work. I took a deep breath and decided to play it cool. "Tell her I'm not in today," I said, hoping she would take the hint and leave. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of another chapter in our messy saga. Later that day, I was sitting at my desk when I noticed my phone buzzing with notifications. I pulled it out to find messages from coworkers saying they saw my mom hanging around outside, insisting on speaking to me. She was refusing to leave until she got what she wanted. I felt a knot in my stomach as I realized I might have to confront her again. Instead of letting her inside, I decided to call her myself. "Mom, I'm not available to talk," I said when she answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "You need to leave my workplace. This isn't the place for this dot." She didn't take it well. "You can't just ignore me like this. I'm your mother," she yelled, and I could hear the desperation in her voice. It was the same old routine, the same emotional manipulation I'd grown tired of. I held my ground. "You don't get to show up unannounced and demand my time or attention. You've made your choices and I've made mine. It's best if you just leave me alone." I could almost hear her jaw clench through the phone. After I hung up, my anxiety spiked. I wondered if she'd just wait for me outside or cause a scene. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, and I couldn't focus on my work. Thankfully, I had a supportive team around me who reassured me that I wasn't alone in this. In the following days, I kept my distance from the office, taking some time off to regroup. I needed to figure out how to handle this situation without letting it derail my life. I thought about speaking to a lawyer to understand my options regarding a restraining order. I didn't want to take drastic measures. but I also couldn't let her continue to intrude into my life like this. During my time off, I took the opportunity to reflect. I realized that I had come too far to allow my mom's chaos to disrupt my hard-earned stability. I felt strong and independent, and it was time to stand my ground once and for all. I started researching my options, gathering information on how to protect myself legally. It felt empowering to take control of the situation instead of letting it control me. After a few days of lying low and gathering my thoughts, I finally decided to speak with a lawyer. I needed to understand my options regarding a restraining order. The consultation was surprisingly straightforward. The lawyer explained the process and what constituted grounds for a restraining order, which made me realize I had a strong case. My mom's behavior had crossed a line, and I had every right to protect myself. Armed with this knowledge, I felt a sense of relief. It was empowering to take concrete steps towards reclaiming my life. I scheduled another appointment to finalize the restraining order paperwork, and the more I talked through my situation with the lawyer, the more confident I became. I was no longer the scared teenager pushed out by my mother. I was an adult taking charge of my life and well-being. In the meantime, I kept receiving those relentless emails from my mom. I ignored them as best as I could, but the emotional toll began to wear on me again. She was relentless, sharing her thoughts about how I was forgetting my roots and turning my back on my family. The more I read, the more determined I became to put an end to this cycle. I realized I needed to put my foot down firmly. I didn't owe her anything, least of all the emotional labor of responding to her guilt trips. Eventually, the day came for me to file the restraining order. My lawyer helped me through the process, and as I signed the documents, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was a significant step in asserting my boundaries. I had to remind myself that taking this action was not about punishment. It was about self-preservation. I was done allowing her toxic behavior into my life. Later that week, I was back at work, feeling a mix of nervousness and relief. I had decided to be transparent with my manager about my situation, mainly because I didn't want any surprises if my mom tried to show up again. My manager was understanding and supportive, assuring me that my safety was a priority. It felt good to know I had a solid support system in place. As the days passed, the emails from my mom became less frequent, but they still trickled in. I had set my phone to filter her messages straight to the junk folder. It felt like a small victory, and I focused on my work and personal life. I started seeing friends more, enjoying my newfound freedom, and really cherishing the relationships I was building. Then, about a week later, I received a call from my uncle. He had heard about my decision to file a restraining order. I appreciated his concern, and I could tell he felt guilty about how things had unfolded. I assured him that I wasn't mad at him. He had good intentions and didn't know how things would play out. He wanted to help, and that meant a lot to me. After that, I took the plunge and officially filed the restraining order. The process was smoother than I had anticipated. The court recognized the history of emotional abuse and manipulation I'd endured, and they granted the order without any complications. It felt surreal to see it all in writing, a formal declaration that I was no longer going to tolerate my mom's interference in my life. It was like closing a door that had been left ajar for far too long. Once the order was in place, I felt a mix of triumph and sadness. It was bittersweet to think about what had transpired, about the relationship I'd lost with my mom. But deep down, I knew I had made the right choice for my mental health. I was no longer that scared kid looking for approval or love from a parent who didn't want me. I was an adult forging my own path. As time passed, I continued to thrive at work. I started taking on more responsibilities and even mentoring new employees. It felt rewarding to give back and help others find their footing, just like I had to. My life was finally beginning to reflect the hard work I had put into it, and I was proud of how far I'd come. One day, while scrolling through social media, I stumbled upon a post that caught my attention. It was a picture of my mom and the twins, all smiles at a family gathering. A pang of regret hit me, but I quickly brushed it aside. I had to remind myself that my mental health and happiness were my priorities now. I didn't want to let her manipulate me back into feeling guilty. Then, out of nowhere, I received a text from my mom. I debated whether to read it or not, but my curiosity got the better of me. The message was filled with more of the same. Apologies wrapped in guilt and sadness, claiming she was trying to reach out and that she missed me. It was frustrating to read. It felt like she was playing the victim again. I didn't respond. Instead, I deleted the message and blocked her number. That decision felt liberating. I was taking control of my life, and it was empowering to choose to move forward without her. I made a promise to myself to focus on the positive relationships I had cultivated over the years. Friends, my grandparents, and even colleagues who had become like family to me. In the end, I knew I had made the right choice. It was time to stop looking back at what could have been and start embracing the future I was building for myself. I'd worked hard to get where I was, and I refused to let anyone, including my mom, dim the light I had finally found within myself.